We're waiting for the end of the commercial break. Okay, well today we're going to get Israel started on its journey to the Promised Land. And so we're going to take a look first at Numbers 10, 11 through 36, which is the actual beginning of the journey. So just a word here about the rest of the book of Numbers, because I think this is really important. So the remainder of the book of Numbers is an account of Israel's journey toward the Promised Land, although in the book of Numbers they won't quite get there because Deuteronomy supposedly recounts what happens immediately before the entrance, and the book of Joshua tells about the entrance itself. And so Numbers is what you might call a sort of theological journey. That is, the story of Israel's journey to the Promised Land isn't just a story about historical events, although it is that. It's also something else. It's also a story about the virtues that are necessary to sustain the life of faith. And I'll be pointing those out as we walk along. So in this journey, Israel is going to rebel against God 7 times. And of course, 7 is the number of completeness. And so the somewhat depressing kind of lesson of Numbers, right, is that even before the people of Israel get into the Promised Land, they already proved themselves to be a people, as a number of the prophets say, to be a stiff-necked people. Now this raises some questions which the Old Testament isn't going to answer, but the question that kind of hovers over this, right? Well, if God has called the people of Israel to reshape the world after sin, and if the people of Israel seem to be almost incurably affected by sin, what's the solution? Okay, we'll have to wait to the New Testament to get that. But that's kind of like hovering in the air. So we'll just want to walk with the people of Israel, and what we'll want to do is we'll want to put ourselves in their shoes. So whenever they do something wrong, the thing that we don't want to do is, yeah, they were really bad and dumb back then, but we're so faithful and lovely right now. Don't think that way. Rather, everything that the people of Israel do in their rebelling against God, we do today. So I'll be trying to point that out. And this is in line actually with something that Paul does. So in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul actually points back to this whole narrative and actually uses it as a corrective for the church in Corinth. That is, he kind of gives a brief account of this journey, and he says, well, look at, the people of Israel, look what happened to them, right? And God judged them, punished them, so look out. Okay, so it's still a relevant story. So let's take a look at Numbers 10, 11 through 36, somewhat briefly. It's important to notice how the journey begins. And here's the initial part of it. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud of the divine glory, lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. And the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time at the command of the Lord by Moses. So notice what happens here. The people of Israel leave Mount Sinai when God makes this clear to them through Moses. So they don't just decide to leave themselves, but here's the really important part is the rest of essentially 14 to the end of chapter 10 describes the order that the people are in. And so it's the ark first, and then the tribes arrayed behind them with the priests and the Levites also. And so this is a really important point. The journey to the Promised Land really isn't just like a journey. This is intentional. It's a procession. It's a procession. They proceed from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, following behind the ark, right? And so the idea here is that what we're getting, and the Old Testament is kind of helpful about this, right? We're seeing what the ideal Israel should look like, right? The people of God falling behind the ark, listening to Moses, listening to God's direction and command, and going in the right direction. That's the ideal Israel. Now, along the way, we'll also catch glimpses of the real Israel. And so Numbers is helping us to constantly contrast, right? This is what Israel's supposed to be. This is what it is. This is what Israel's supposed to be. This is what it is. And the difference between the two, obviously, is the thing we call sin. Same as today, right? We can talk about this is what the church is supposed to be. This is what the church is. And the difference between the two is called sin. So that they set off. And as they go, Moses says something really important right at the end of the chapter. It's Numbers 10, 33 and following. So they set out from the mount of the Lord, 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them, 3 days' journey, to seek out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was over them whenever they set out from the camp. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he said, "Lord, return to the 10,000 of Israel." So what Moses is saying is this. As they set up on the journey, Moses is expressing a kind of confidence in God that two things will happen. Number one, that God is going to journey with the people from where they are now to where they're going to go. And we'll see that in fact actually does turn out to be the case. And the other thing that Moses expresses is that along the way, whatever challenges or difficulties or obstacles await the people of Israel will count on God to deal with them. Okay, so notice what's going on here. This is the idea here, right, that the people of Israel, as they're on this journey, right, they're doing two things. First of all, they're trusting God, and they're listening for his voice, okay? And they're also trusting that whatever difficulties that they encounter, God is going to somehow make it possible for them to deal with those difficulties. So notice what we have here. Here we have sort of like a model of what God's people are always supposed to be doing, right? God's people are defined by an attentiveness to his voice, and they're also defined by their trusting that God's going to lead them on their journey. Okay? Now, we're going to see that this breaks down almost immediately. but it's really important that we get this picture of what the ideal people of God actually looks like. So, two important virtues here. Receptivity to God and a trust and obedience in God's direction and provision. And that means, this is kind of like the negative side of this, right? This means that one of the things that can like destroy or undermine faith is when the people shift their attention from trusting in God to focusing on their immediate fears and worries. Okay? That is, the problems start, right, when the people of Israel shift from, okay, yeah, God's with us, and he's going to guide us on this journey, to, oh my gosh, how can we deal with this? Okay, so we're going to see that focus shifts again and again and again. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. A dramatic sort of portrayal of this is in the story, remember, where the disciples are in the boat, and Jesus comes walking on water beside them in the storm, and Jesus invites Peter to get out. And Peter does. He gets out of the boat and starts to move toward Jesus. So initially his eyesight is focused on Jesus. Then his eyesight shifts to the storm, and that's when he starts to sink. Okay, your focus shifts. You're then focused on the problems and difficulties, and then glug, 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 glug. Peter starts to sink. So that's what we have here. Okay, so it's not going to surprise anyone probably to note that chapter 10 ends at verse 36, And the first rebellion occurs in chapter 11, verse 1. So let's see what it is. This is rebellion number 1. It's Numbers 11, 1 through 3. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. And Taberah in Hebrew simply means something like burning or on fire. So almost immediately upon setting out, we have this wonderful procession. They're following the ark. They're kind of following behind God. And all of a sudden it starts. They start complaining. And this word complain is really important in the book of Numbers. We'll also see some translations will also render it grumbling. They start complaining about their misfortune. So notice what's going on here. Their attention has already shifted from the fact that God has delivered them from slavery in Egypt, brought them across the Red Sea, brought them to Mount Sinai, made a covenant with them, and sustained them with manna in the wilderness. All that is now forgotten. And what they're now focused on is their sort of like momentary and present discomforts. And so they complain. Now I think it's really important to acknowledge here that in the Old Testament, and really in the New too, complaint is always sort of like a spiritual flashing red light. It's a sign of danger. That is, complaint, generally speaking, is a sign that one no longer has much thankfulness toward God. Right? That's the idea. So we forget the blessings, and now we're laser focused on the problems, and we start grumbling, complaining, that kind of thing. Now here's another important kind of spiritual virtue for the life of faith. One of the things we'll see here in the book of Numbers is that misfortune actually can play an important role in the life of faith, right? Now we do have Christians today, right? They're generally adherents to what sometimes is called the prosperity gospel, right? God wants to make you rich. If you just believe enough, you'll get everything you want. Pray hard enough, and that new Mercedes that you want, it'll be in your driveway right away, and your portfolio will, blossom, and things will be great. And if you're poor, right, that's just a sign that you don't have enough faith. So get with it. That's the prosperity gospel. It's utterly false. Don't pay any attention to it whatsoever. Forget it. The lesson of Numbers is that actually difficulties can be helpful in the life of faith for two reasons. On one hand, right, difficulties can be an opportunity to increase our trust in God. Right? You kind of get to that point where you're going through like a really difficult time, and it suddenly dawns on you, what? I can't do this anymore. I can't do this alone. I wasn't supposed to do it alone. Right? So, in effect, right, difficulties can be an invitation to trusting God more. Also, too, another really good thing about difficulties, right, is we can learn something in the midst of difficulty about our true character. Right? We're all pretty good when things are going well, but things, our real self kind of comes out when things start to go bad, right? And we, there's that person that you work with that you don't like and who always is talking, and you're in the midst of having to listen, and then something else happens, and then you go home and something else bad happens, and there's like a cascade of bad events, right? Then the true self is going to come out, right? And so we learn something about ourselves, right? We learn that sometimes, like, we kind of put on a happy face and make everyone think that we're okay and everything's lovely when that's really not true. So difficulties can be helpful here. The people of Israel need to learn this lesson. And so here they are. They've forgotten all their blessings. And now they're laser focused on their problems. and they don't see their problems as an opportunity to trust God, and they don't see their problems as an opportunity to learn something about themselves. The only thing they want in the midst of difficulty is relief. That's all they want. And so they complain. And as Paul reminded the people in Corinth, in 1 Corinthians 10, God's response to the complaining and grumbling is he sends kind of like fire around the outer edges of the procession, and some of them are like incinerated. Now this may sound bad, right? But I think it's important, right, to remember here, right, that fire in the Old Testament is always a sign of purification. So what's going on here, right? God has to purify his people. And lo and behold, right, that's actually the purpose of this whole journey. The purpose of the whole journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land is it's a journey of purification. It's sort of like here's, I think, a good way to think about this, right, is that the journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land is kind of like Israel's version of Lent, right? It's a time of introspection, purification. Who are we really? What do we really believe in? What do we really trust in? So that's going on. And so rebellion number one. Now, rebellion number one ends in Numbers 11:3. Rebellion number two begins in 11:4. Okay, so here it is. This is a longer narrative, which I'm going to have to kind of shorten just a little bit. It's 11:4 to 34. So we'll take a look at pieces of it. So here's how the rebellion starts. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish, and we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." So there's the complaint. So let's take a look at what it is, and then I want to put it in context. So remember, we read about the manna way back in Exodus 16 about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. But notice what's going on here. So they're going along, and some of the people, right, they're called like the rabble. They begin to complain because they have, and this is key, a strong craving. And their craving is, and this is really important, their craving is for all the wonderful food that they had way back in Egypt, which we all know was such a wonderful and lovely place, right? It's like, if we could only go back to Shea Pharaoh for one more meal, So notice what's going on here. They recount in detail all the kinds of food that they had back in Egypt. Fish and cucumbers and melons and leeks and onion and garlic. Notice what we're being told here. We're being told that while the people of Israel have been led out of Egypt physically, spiritually and mentally, they're still there. Spiritually and mentally, they are still in Egypt. And they need to be brought out. So there's the physical deliverance, but there's also the spiritual and the mental deliverance that needs to take place as well. And that's another thing, one of the things that God is working on. And so notice what they say. Our strength is dried up because we have nothing but this manna to eat, the manna that God has miraculously provided. So notice what's happened, right? They've taken a blessing for granted, and now they're unthankful for it, right? And so now they've got these ideal images in their minds of just how lovely Egypt was, and they've forgotten their blessings. So here's a little bit more about what happens. Now the manna was like coriander seed in its appearance and like that of bdellium, and the people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills and beat it with mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. And Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans. So notice here, they're not only now complaining, they're like crying. I mean, this is like, this is like the 2-year-old, in the midst of a tantrum, right? Who, no matter what you say, they want what they want. And, the way these things tend to work, right, is that, children tend to have the tantrum like at the worst possible moment, right? Preferably when other people are around, right? Preferably in a really public space like, Publix, where everybody can look at them throwing a tantrum and think about what an awful parent you are, right? So that's what's going on here. So they're all kind of weeping and moaning and wailing and kind of like wallowing in their own ingratitude. And now, notice, Moses now is kind of pulled into this. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth? Did you say to me, carry them in your bosom, and as a nurse carries a child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give this people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat to eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me." So now Moses has been sucked in, and now Moses is complaining. Okay, so let's think about 2 New Testament stories that kind of resonate with this little scene here. Scene number 1. This is Matthew 4, 1 through 4. This is part of Matthew's account of Jesus' temptations in the wilderness. Remember the first temptation that's placed before Jesus? If you're the Son of God, why don't you just turn some of these stones into loaves of bread? Because I bet you're really hungry at this point, because you've been out in the wilderness without food for how long did you say? 40 days? Oh, you must be famished. Loaf of bread would really be good about this time, wouldn't it? That is, notice what's going on here. Matthew is setting up a contrast between Jesus and the people of Israel, right? The people of Israel are focused on their own immediate needs. Jesus is focused on his mission. And that's the contrast. Okay, so one kind of New Testament resonance here that's, I think, really important to note here. The other is this. This is in John 6. Remember, this is the story of John's story of the feeding of the 5,000, which the bread of heaven, right? I am the bread of heaven that's come down for the life of the world. Remember what happens when Jesus invites the disciples to feed the 5,000, and they say to him, "You got to be nuts. There's no way we could come up with enough bread for all these people, right? Jesus, you need to come down from your spiritual cloud and get real. There's no way this can be done." Notice here, Moses is kind of in the same place. Moses here has gotten the thought that somehow the weight or burden of the people of Israel now rests completely on his shoulders. And where on earth is he going to come up with enough food to feed all of these people? Now, of course, we know, right, from reading the story, that God never expected Moses to carry the burden by himself ever. And from the word go, he actually hasn't. But he's gotten himself to a place where he thinks that he is. Okay, so once again, there's sort of like a sort of like spiritual warning, right? The dangerous thing occurs, right, when we get so focused on ourselves that we come to the belief, right, that somehow, it's all on me. Somehow, right, whatever's going on, it's all on me. My life is all on me, St. Peter's is all on me, my family's all on me, this is all on me. I feel burdened, I feel overstretched, I feel tired, I feel angry, I'm frustrated, da-da-da-da-da. That's where Moses is. And so notice what he says in 11:14. I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. To which God says, yes, that's absolutely right. Okay? Duh. Moses has kind of gotten himself into kind of a dark place. So here's what happens, and I'm compressing the story a little bit just for the sake of time. Thing number one, in 11:16, God actually addresses Moses' concern. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and officers over them. And bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. I will come down and talk with you there. And I will take some of the Spirit that is upon you, and I will put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. And this is kind of the humorous part. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat meat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you. Okay, you want meat? Here it comes. I'm going to stuff it down your throats. Okay, that'll give you something else to complain about. So there. Notice what happens here, and I think this is really important. Notice what God does. This is sort of a sign of God's mercy, right? God doesn't say to Moses simply, okay, look, you're like totally focused on yourself. Get over it. God says, okay, look, I understand. You're feeling overwhelmed. You're feeling burdened. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to gather up 70 of Israel's elders, and I want you all to go to the tent of meeting where you meet with me, and I'm going to come and meet with you. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the Spirit that I've put on you, some of the authority that I've put on you, and I'm going to distribute it out to them. And they'll help you. Okay? You won't feel alone anymore. Now, I just want to add a little footnote here. It's not only a sign of God's mercy to Moses, right? It's God's graciousness and his willingness to kind of bear with the people of Israel, but also something really important is being introduced at this point that we don't want to miss. It's the notion of a kind of mediated authority that will prove very important not only for the people of Israel, but later on in the church, right? Jesus is going to call 12 disciples, and he's going to give them authority. That is, they will have a mediated authority, which they will pass on to other people, right? In today's lesson from Timothy, right, we read about one of those people who passed on authority, Paul, who passed on a mediated authority to Timothy. So that's what's going on here. It'll continue to go on in the church, right? It's the idea of a mediated authority. God gives authority to certain people. They share it with others. It's all for the benefit of God and his people. And then we have the quail come to feed the people of Egypt. And so the Spirit of Moses gets distributed upon the 70 elders, and then the quail. All right, so that's the second thing. Now, I think one of the lessons we want to take from this is this. I emphasize the ESV's idea of the strong craving. That is, the people of Israel here develop a kind of strong desire for something. And I think what's being said here is, among other things, that another virtue that's necessary for the life of faith is the virtue of temperance. Now, I'm not talking about temperate societies here. The word temperance actually is used in a slightly off way there. But temperance here has to do with the ability to exercise self-discipline over desires. And if we fast forward to Galatians 5, right, it's not surprising to learn, right, that self-control is one of the fruit of the Spirit. Okay, that is, notice what's going on here. The idea here is that as human beings, right, you know, we have all kinds of desires at any given moment, right? And if we're not able to kind of put some sort of break on those desires, if we have no way of like sorting them out, that's not just going to make us jerks, okay? And we could sort of look at, the example of like supposed adults, right, who still can't control their emotions, right? And who kind of like, whatever pops in their mind at every given minute, that's kind of what they do or say or think. The inability to control desires or emotions isn't just going to make someone a jerk, it's also going to undermine their faithfulness to God. And that's what we see here in this story, right? The people of Israel get into their minds, right, that their basic focus in life is what they want at this very moment. And that becomes the be-all and end-all of everything. And that kind of strong desire, that strong craving now, in effect, undercuts their obedience to God. Once again, the contrast here is Jesus in Matthew 4, right, who's been in the wilderness for 40 days, fasting, and, says no, no, no to all the temptations that are put before him, right? He does it because he's focused on the mission that he's been given. The people of Israel need to acquire the virtue of temperance. So at the end of chapter 11, this is kind of how the story all winds up. Another kind of important thing happens, and that is, this is in 11:26 and following. Now 2 men remained in the camp, one named Eldad and the other named Medad. And the Spirit rested on them. That is the Spirit that God took from Moses and gave to the 70. They were among those registered, but they had not gone out to the tent. And so they prophesied in the camp. And a young man ran and told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, My Lord Moses, stop them. But Moses said to him, Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. So after this kind of gathering of the 70 elders at the tent of meeting, where God puts the Spirit of Moses on each of them, right? We find out about these 2 other elders who actually didn't come to the great meeting. And yet somehow God put the Spirit upon them, and they're out there prophesying in the camp. And here prophesying is simply a reference to, right, they're speaking a message from God to the people. And so someone hears this, and he runs and tells Moses. He says, Moses, there are two guys in the camp who are prophesying. You got to stop them. They don't have a prophet certificate from you. Stop them. And Joshua, the kind of the loyal assistant, says, well, I'll go take care of them. And Moses said, wait. No. You're looking at it the wrong way. Moses wants them to back up and see things from like a larger perspective, right? Moses' point here is, look, if God has put the Spirit upon these particular 2 men, he's done it for a reason. And our job is to accept it. Okay? And then Moses says this, and I think this is really important. Are you jealous for my sake? This is where we get an insight into Moses' character, right? Moses, look, I understand what's going on. I understand, right, that you see these 2 men somehow as like a challenge to my authority. Don't worry. I'm not worried about my authority. Okay, so you shouldn't be either. Okay, so yeah, that's the way it is. And then he says this, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. Of course, this is obviously looking forward to something that occurs in the second chapter of the book of Acts, the event that occurs on the day of Pentecost, right? Where Moses expressed this thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if like all of God's people were prophets? Not just the 70 of us, or, not just Eldad and Medad or something like that, right? But wouldn't it be interesting, wouldn't it be wonderful if like all of God's people were prophets? And so he's kind of looking forward to what will eventually happen in the second chapter of the book of Acts. Now we're just about out of time, so I'll just set up the next rebellion, but we'll save it for next week. So the next rebellion begins in 1135, and now the rebellion is closer to home. First, it was all the people rebelling. Then it was like the rabble. Now things are going to get a little close to home because we're going to find that the people now leading the rebellion are Moses' brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, who have become jealous of his authority. And so we'll learn another really important kind of spiritual principle, right? That one of the most deadly things in the people of God is for one person to become jealous of somebody else's spiritual gift. What happens, as we'll see, right? Both Aaron and Miriam essentially do the same thing. Why didn't God allow me to be like Moses and be like a strong, charismatic, brilliant leader who's out in front and and the actions all whirling around him? Why do I have to be like, back here somewhat behind the scenes or whatever, right? And so we'll see, right, that one of the things that's always bad is when we have a situation where somebody develops a kind of jealousy for somebody else's spiritual gift, forgetting, as Paul will remind us later, right, that all spiritual gifts are given for the people of God as a whole. Okay, so Aaron and Miriam have forgotten this, and this is a really serious problem because it's important to remember who Aaron is. Aaron is the high priest of Israel, and yet in the next rebellion we'll find him consumed with jealousy, and we'll find out what has to happen about that. So rebellion number 3, and then 4 more rebellions after that, and that'll pretty much get us through the book of Numbers.